Hi there, and thank you for joining us for Mastering the Next Generation of West Virginia Science Standards. My name's Francis Vigent. I'm CEO here at KnowAtom. My background is as a teacher, first as a high school math teacher, and then as an elementary and middle school science, technology, engineering, and math specialist. I've been a part of KnowAtom almost 10 years now, and I suppose it might make sense to explain a little bit about what KnowAtom is, why we exist, and so on. So KnowAtom is an organization of teachers, folks who all have spent time in public education classrooms, and really we focus on higher order thinking skills. We might call them critical thinking skills sometimes, or higher order thinking skills, but specifically they are the skills to create, evaluate, and analyze. And the way that we help classrooms to achieve that sort of focus through instruction is really by putting students into the role of scientist and engineer in the classroom as the mode of instruction and really the environment for teaching and the experience for learning. And when you think about that, that's where curriculum, materials, and professional development come in. Really, once you have a standards focus, once you are really thinking about, sharpening these critical thinking skills, then curriculum, materials, professional development have relevance. And I guess one question that folks might ask is, why even bother with science? Why bother with engineering? Why have next generation science standards and so on? And the answer comes back again to that higher order thinking. The next generation science standards, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the differences here specifically for West Virginia, but they're really aimed at creating, evaluating, and analyzing simultaneously. Students being focused on developing those skills, using those skills, practicing those skills. And so that's why the next generation science standards exist in 3 dimensions. Those are the disciplinary core ideas, the cross-cutting concepts, and the science and engineering practices. And next generation science standards, the original next generation science standards, are considered performance expectations. So what's happened with those standards is that they have been transformed from something that is traditionally kind of a fact-based, remember this kind of a standard, and turn into something that a student is going to need to be able to demonstrate in context. And that would be a novel context, something that's related to what they've learned, but basically a scenario that is unpredictable. 2 children by unpredictable names engage in a certain experiment, and they get certain results, and so they may come to certain conclusions, and students are expected, now these are real students, are expected to be able to look at a scenario like that, engage their skills, and be able to kind of evaluate, work with it, and explain with the use of evidence and so on why a particular perspective is or is not supported in these fictional students' experience and data. So when you think about it that way, there's a big transition between the former standards in West Virginia and next generation science standards. And we're going to talk about West Virginia specifically, but most states who consider themselves to have adopted next generation science standards have not made the kind of changes and restructuring that West Virginia has made. And that, as an educator myself, I can't imagine teaching the West Virginia science standards the way that they've been articulated, simply because they're very hard to follow and they are relatively vague, such that assessing them and understanding what will be assessed is as difficult as teaching something that is specific enough to actually lead students to a level of proficiency which is detectable. So it's an interesting situation. During this webinar, we're going to take a little bit of a look at West Virginia's science standards approach and some of the similarities and differences between that and the actual next generation science standards, which were published back in 2013 by Achieve and so on. And take a look at what makes these new next generation science standards tougher. How do the new standards link to Common Core Math and ELA? What are some of the transitions that are going to affect the methods for science instruction, K through 12? And thinking more broadly as we come back to these higher order thinking skills, how do science and engineering practices integrate with art? And there's a lot of focus on these 21st century skills in the 21st century classroom, and we're almost 2 decades into the 21st century. It would be really nice to think that something like the next generation science standards, which are a 21st century set of standards, are something that, like the version that has come forth from Achieve and the 26 partner states, something that will really elevate critical thinking in the classroom, because that's the way that they were designed. So nonetheless, let's jump in here. One of the things that's kind of unique about West Virginia is that the standards are relatively newly adopted. In fact, that depending on when you're viewing this, whether you're on the live session or viewing a recording, the implementation of next generation science standards in West Virginia is only effective on July 1st of 2016. That's when they go into effect. What you see on the right is Title 126, the Board of Education legislative rule that puts the new standards into place, taking the place of the 2009 standards. So there was a lot of kind of public debate and politics that came into play in West Virginia, which are kind of an interesting soap opera in and of itself. There was sort of a number of legislators that took exception to the sort of positioning of climate and climate change within the original version of the Next Generation Science Standards. And so they wanted to tweak some wording around that climate temperatures can increase and decrease, essentially, and to soften the language around human influence, the influence of human activity over the standards themselves. So, whether that is related to fossil fuels, and West Virginia is widely known as a top coal exporting state. If there's some connection there, I suppose we'll never know. But nonetheless, I guess the changes that are going to affect West Virginia educators between the Next Generation Science Standards and the actual standards adopted by West Virginia in this Title 126 are far more significant than a couple of words around the climate question. And one of the pieces I guess we should maybe jump to is the present standards in West Virginia look like this. So you see, grade 5, you have standard 1, it relates to the nature of science, and then you have sort of some performance expectations. Students will demonstrate understanding of history of science, demonstrate understanding of science as human endeavor, encompassing contributions of diverse cultures and scientists, and so on. Then you have some performance descriptors, which kind of act as a rubric, in essence, showing between novice, or essentially kind of a warning, or below basic level of understanding, all the way to sort of exemplary distinguished levels of understanding, with objectives down the bottom here. Students will realize that scientists formulate and test their explanations of nature using observation and experiments. And then, objective 2, recognize scientific knowledge is subject to modification as new scientific information challenges current explanations, and so on. And as I'm sure you've already experienced under the existing standards, and again, maybe the former standards, depending on when you view this, these are incredibly vague articulation of standards from an assessment perspective. For instance, how do you assess that a student realizes that scientists formulate and test their explanations of nature using observation and experiments? Pretty difficult. and others are much easier to test in the sense of actually understand whether or not a student has reached the objective. For instance, applying skepticism, careful methods, logical reasoning, and creativity in investigating the observable universe. You know, a lot of things in here are still subjective, but within a constructed response, we could observe a student, you know, applying skepticism, applying logical reasoning, creating something related to an investigation. And careful methods is kind of a vague term, but perhaps we could observe precision, at least adequate, if not exceptional precision in investigating the observable universe. So under the existing standards, there's kind of a mixture of things that can be assessed without such a degree of subjective influence that either everybody passes or everybody fails, or it's unpredictable as to whether a student passes or fails, and something that is actually measurable and something that can be communicated to students and can be a benchmark by which students reach a mastery level. And you can see that too within the performance descriptors. Evaluate the importance of the research of scientists in diverse cultures throughout history. You know, really hard to say what that entails, especially when you compare it to something that's, you know, a little bit lower, as it's explained here, explaining the sequential relevance of research of scientists in diverse cultures throughout history. You know, explaining the sequential relevance of diverse cultures research throughout history is, you know, probably an infinite task, but something that's, you know, kind of interesting to have as part of the standards and, you know, potentially difficult to measure. The next generation science standards are very different. The next generation science standards are actually relatively easy to measure. They're very specific. They involve multiple dimensions which are clearly articulated, and they differ. So the original next generation science standards differ quite widely from what the next generation of West Virginia science standards appear like, at least in the legislation. So you can see here, this is actually from that earlier legislative piece, which you see here, Title 126. Here are the standards, which are referred to as, you know, next generation. However, they're really quite different. So you have a bit of a fluffy explanation up here, and a reminder that all West Virginia teachers are responsible for classroom instruction that integrates content literacy and the 21st century learning skills and technology tools. So the standards that you see here are supposed to be infused within content literacy and 21st century learning skills and technology tools frameworks, which, you know, you can sort of find those within the framework documentation and kind of try to pull the two together. The way the next generation science standards in their original form are articulated, everything is already integrated. So what's happened here is that West Virginia has basically isolated different, what next generation science creators would call elements of the dimensions and elements of the standards, and tried to break them out as objectives, basically trying to take what you see here, which is the actual next generation science standard documentation, isolate elements of the dimensions, which you see here. So this is one dimension, science and engineering practices. This is the second dimension, disciplinary core ideas. And this is the third dimension, cross-cutting concepts. What West Virginia has done is modified some language and isolated elements of these, which you see here, and tried to make them into objectives, and basically try to back into the existing sort of model for displaying standards. So some of this, you know, performance descriptors and so on doesn't exactly exist, at least in this documentation that's been published yet. But this is what the next generation science standards look like. You have a performance expectation, and then you have the actual dimensions that performance expectation is demonstrated within. So think about these three dimensions as the context or the scenario, elements of the scenario, where a student would have to develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So as a result of instruction in the classroom, where there's sort of next generation inquiry going on and students are engaging in the content, which is the disciplinary core dimension, by using their skills that they've developed, which is the science and engineering practices, to develop and use that content to observe the systems and the way the content interacts with other areas of content, which is what the cross-cutting concepts is about, systems and systems models, the systems thinking kind of dimension. That classroom context is where students are able to first engage in trying to develop a model to describe the movement of matter, and then as a result of engaging in that, they learn the expectations, they practice the skills, they develop and use the content, and they observe the phenomena of the systems. And so when it comes around to being tested in the class or in a standardized test, they're able to perform quite well because they have developed their understanding in context and can now demonstrate their understanding in another context. And that's the way the next generation science standards were originally designed. When you look at the way that they are now, you still have some of the issues. So back to sort of that early piece where I was saying that some of this is very maybe vague or difficult to measure and really quantify, I guess, in terms of something that is not subjective. Well, when you look at something like this, a system can be described in terms of its components and their interaction. So if a student can look at something like an ecosystem and describe it in terms of its components, so for instance, herbivores, carnivores, producers, consumers, elements of a food chain, food webs, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different parts and different systems that could be seen in an ecosystem. But if a student can observe those parts and actually describe them and then talk about how they interact, then that's something that we can measure and we can actually observe in terms of the student's behavior. Same thing over here. The food of almost any kind of animal can be traced back to plants. Organisms are related in food webs in which some animals eat plants for food and other animals eat the animals that eat the plants, and so on here. So we can see if a student understands that through questions around transfer of matter in food chains or in food webs, or by presenting with multiple food chains and ask them how those food chains may form a food web. So again, this is something that can be quantified and observed and actually measured, which helps us understand and teach as well as understand the product of teaching in the classroom. Same thing over here, science and engineering practices, develop a model to describe phenomena. So if a student looks at a picture of some different animals and plants in a forest, they can look at them and actually talk about the relationships between them and actually describe them perhaps as a food chain or a food web. And so that right there, by saying, the rabbit eats the rabbit eats the grass, and the grass is getting energy from the sun, then what we've just done is and this is part of a food chain, we have developed a basic model to describe the phenomenon of how energy and matter transfer from the sun, or at least energy transfers from the sun to the rabbit. Okay, so that's something again that can be measured and assessed and seen in terms of testing, but as well as from a teaching standpoint. We can actually teach students to look at scenarios and describe them, describe the phenomenon with models. Okay, same thing with the way the moon orbits the Earth, the way that the Earth orbits the sun, so on. Those are models that describe phenomena that we observe in nature. So nonetheless, when we look at these objectives, some of them, like developing a model to describe that matter is made of particles too small to be seen, is great. measuring and graphing quantities to provide evidence that regardless of the type of change that occurs when heating, cooling, or mixing substances, the total weight of matter is conserved, and actually it really would be the total mass of or matter is conserved. But nonetheless, here's what we have to work with. So these are great and measurable, but what they lack is the context that the other dimensions add because they've been so isolated. See, when you look at something like developing a model to describe phenomenon, we get a context for that by looking at the disciplinary core idea. And then we think about the system and its components and their interactions. We get a context from that by thinking about the disciplinary core ideas and also the practices. So that's very helpful from a teaching standpoint, and understanding that students are going to need to be able to develop a model to describe how matter moves among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So they all kind of fit together. Breaking them out this way makes it much more difficult to teach, to assess, and really to learn, because when teaching is difficult, learning or teaching is fragmented, or learning is fragmented and vague, and if the assessment is somewhat fragmented and vague, these are a lot of opportunities for kind of missed opportunities, in a sense, of mismatches, misunderstandings, and ultimately that has the potential to negatively impact students' learning. So it's great to say what students will do, but we need some context to that, which is unfortunately a bit lacking here. What I would recommend to you is to really invest some time as an educator in understanding the origins of what you have in West Virginia and understanding how they come together and how they relate in the original standards, because ultimately when it comes to assessing science, if and when West Virginia comes around to doing that through standardized testing, under these new standards, those tests, unless West Virginia produces them in-house, are to be heavily influenced by the origins of the West Virginia Next Generation Science Standards. And so they're going to be developed with the original construction in mind, so you can kind of do an end run and understand the context for things like making observations and measurements to identify materials based on their properties by seeing where that originally came from and how it was articulated in the foundations and as it relates to the performance expectations themselves. So that would be my best advice to you in thinking about mastering these new, or the next generation of West Virginia science standards. I would break it apart a little bit further here. So when you think about the science and engineering practices dimension, anytime you see something that's a skill, really it originates from one of these 8. And the idea here is, and these are the wording of the 8, not my wording, but the original wording. The idea is that these are skills which students will develop and be able to demonstrate and really practice, I guess, is the idea here, in context, especially unfamiliar context which is the product of direct instruction. A student is expected to be able to ask questions in a scientific context, define problems in an engineering context, to not only use a model but be able to develop one, not only carry out an investigation but to be able to plan one, not only interpret data but be able to analyze it, and to think not only critically but mathematically and computationally. And what that means is thinking about orders of magnitude, thinking about how math can be a tool to take raw data and make that raw data useful for understanding whether or not plants are growing faster on average or not, perhaps slower on average, in one trial or in one treatment versus another. We could think of the same thing when it comes to scale of prototypes, resources required for creating prototypes. Same thing when it comes to planning an investigation in scientific context, materials that are involved. Constructing explanations for science as well as engineering, but in the case of engineering, designing solutions. So thinking about using evidence to support a claim, whether it's about a solution or an explanation, and actually reason that claim from the specific evidence to form a compelling argument. And so that's where we come into engaging in argument from evidence. It's not good enough to have an opinion. You actually need evidence for that opinion. Obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Again, the foundation of both science and engineering, the nature of science and engineering, is having math at the center that we can quantify and analyze and communicate our results in such a way that we can also reflect on our hypotheses or our solutions to understand whether they answer the question or solve a problem. And so that's where that contextualized project-based learning that you see possible under the next generation science standards is so important. And the idea that these dimensions, the elements and dimensions, all come together in this context in the classroom, and that these are performance expectations, really enables this kind of deep learning and deep skill set. And unfortunately, isolating and breaking them out this way, maybe make that less obvious. And so, again, I strongly urge you to go back and take a look at effective K-12 STEM education and the National Academy's press. It's free for download. And also take a look at the original form of the standards that were published in 2013, available directly from the Next Generation website, because it's going to make what you see here in the next generation of West Virginia standards much clearer, much easier to integrate with content literacy, as well as the 21st century learning skills and technology tools that West Virginia has published. One of the things, I guess, one of the writers who was the people have a lot of concern about the way that these have been broken out, and some have mentioned that the overall integrity of the standards is really compromised when states start to remove specific pieces and reorganize them this way in such a way that it kind of opens Pandora's box. So it's interesting. But when you think about what you see in the classroom, whether it's second grade and it looks something like this, or it's fourth grade or fifth grade and looks something like this, the idea is that students are going well beyond what's in a textbook, because the idea of nonfiction reading in this next generation inquiry environment is really to lay a foundation for common understanding among the students. And then what happens from there is that those students are engaged in Socratic dialogue, so you're asking higher order thinking questions that require students to actually engage in creating, evaluating, or analyzing in their response, and then not playing the role of sage on the stage, but actually pulling other students into that conversation skillfully as a teacher, asking what they think of that student's contribution. Do they agree with it? Do they not agree with it? Why? How? And again, sort of, and based on what? Causing the student to have to think creatively, evaluatively, and analytically about their peers' thoughts as well and the contributions. So this is where a culture of critique really develops in a STEM classroom under the next generation science standards, and is really important to kind of realize that without that kind of culture, well, first and foremost, without understanding the standards and without seeing how these pieces come together, you're going to have a hard time creating that culture and creating sort of a framework that scaffolds from one concept to the next, which is really what you want to do, try to pool standards together and then scaffold the context. And also, while there may be some grade-specific standards, the idea that you group standards introducing, mastering, and reinforcing in each grade level is recommended through by the PEAK alignment guidelines for next generation science standards. So PEAK is spelled P-E-E-C, so P, 2 E's, and a C. And that's the performance evaluation criteria for curriculum. So this is what you'll see in the classroom, but what's behind it is planning. So before a student is engaged hands-on, they've engaged in reading, they've engaged in Socratic dialogue, and then there's been a problem or question in which students now have to plan their investigation. And yes, that requires materials of some sort. But that planned investigation is actually students developing a nonfiction text. And that nonfiction text is an opportunity for students to put their thoughts and ideas, which are unique to their team, into play. And that makes it authentic. And so the role of the materials is then to actually carry out that plan, gather data through testing, use that data to form an evidence-based conclusion, which they can then argue in a debrief among their class from their evidence as well. So that, both in writing as well as, orally. So that's a huge component of what it means to be a scientist or engineer, and a huge piece of the next generation science standards that is a shift away from sort of the old school standards as well. This is that kind of model of, again, thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. Lower order thinking is remembering, understanding, applying, and higher order thinking, analyzing, evaluating, creating. And with the new science standards, evaluating, creating, and analyzing should be happening simultaneously, and it should be observable through, or really required and observable through the kind of questions that we ask of students in Socratic dialogue, the kind of questions that are involved in our assessments, and whether those assessments are standardized and implemented at a state level, or merely an assessment that we generate in our classrooms. So again, less worksheets, no worksheets really, but the reliance on remembering, understanding, and applying, is through creating, evaluating, and analyzing, because activities which only require lower order thinking don't really achieve the goals of the next generation science standards. So one way to kind of view what this might look like is to take a look at what the DC public schools have done in their next generation science assessments, which went into effect in May of 2016 at the grade 5, 8, and 10 level through high school biology. And their goal was, prior to this, and certainly by the time of this implementation, was that all K-12 schools would implement materials that are aligned with NGSS and implement them with fidelity. And the kind of assessment that they did was computer-based, although it didn't have to be. It was computer-based, and you can see it's crossing the different strands or different content domains: physical science, life science, earth and space science, and the engineering and applications of science and technology strand as well. And the type of assessment that they did had, because it was computer-based, they were able to add a third test item type, which involved, it's kind of unique to computers, what's called technology-enhanced items. It's things like dragging and dropping. You have a picture of an animal, drag and drop it to the right location in a food chain or food web. That would be an example of a tech-enhanced item. But the other two items are the same kind of items that we typically see in standardized testing. A selected response, which is multiple choice, and a constructed response, which is an open response question, which a student would have to write a response to. So what that looks like really shouldn't differ in a lot of ways from what classroom instruction should be, creating an opportunity for students to create through their plans and so on. This is a released item, or a sample item, I guess I should say, that was released in 2015 for this 2016 assessment run. And what you see here is that the student who's being tested is given a scenario. That scenario involves two fictional students, Trevor and Kayla, and the students are involved in planting a seed in their classroom, or actually planting two seeds in their classroom, and one is being grown in a bottle with just water and nutrients, and the other is being grown in the ground. Both are treated under some similar conditions, the amount of light and watering routine and so on. And the students are provided sort of a description of how the hydroponic device, the water-only growth device, was constructed, and a procedure for how the seeds were treated, and then data tables that show how the two seeds, sprouted and grew over the course of 4 weeks. And that serves as data for two fictional sort of claims or conclusions that were drawn by each student, so Trevor as well as Kayla. And what's asked of the real student who's being assessed here is which of these claims are correct, and to explain why Kayla or Trevor's claim is correct using evidence to support their choice. So here, the student is going to be expected to identify the claim that they're going to talk about, whether the claim is correct, or in this case they're asking whose claim is correct. So they would be talking about perhaps Kayla. Kayla's claim that the bean plants grew better in water and so on was correct because, and then they have to be able to look at the two charts and extract evidence from it to support the claim that they are making about these fictional students' claims. And so that's really key. So you can see here that the student who's being assessed is going to have to not only have a basic concept of the content here, what it means to grow as a plant and what a stem is and so forth, and nutrients and whatnot, but also they are going to have a set of skills where they can go into somebody else's investigation and extract from it meaning. Well, first of all, understand it, extract meaning, and then be able themselves to use what they extract from this fictional scenario to construct an explanation about which claim is correct based on the data given. And that is really skillful. That sets a high bar for students, and this is a 5th grade assessment. So you can imagine that this is what a 5th grade student would be expected to do, to perform. And you can see that's why those standards are considered performance expectations, because here you can see that a student who's being tested is going to be required to perform the expectation of the standard. And it's going to relate to those 3 dimensions that are beneath it, require those skills, that content knowledge, and an ability to observe the phenomenon or understand what phenomena is being observed. Now, that scenario sort of plays forward. Those fictional students, Trevor and Kayla, play out in other test items, and you can see here this is one of those technology-enhanced drag and drop examples. Pull, drag and drop, plants, animals, and so on into the food web down below. But then there's also a constructed response where students are going to have to explain how their model shows the shortest way that the energy from plants gets to the fox. Now, this is a little bit of poor wording. What this really should say, because the student didn't construct the model, is that the student should explain which is the shortest way that energy can get from plants to the fox. And then they could actually, well, they would have a plant here, they would have the fox here, and they would look and be able to understand that there are 3 hops or 3 energy transfers between these 4 members, basically every which way except for this path here on the left, and from this path on the right through that organism, which is here on the left. So that would be a constructed response. On the right, and you can see here that the connections are already given. So it's up to the student to kind of move those parts around, get them in the right place. Over here on the right, similarly, you see a multiple choice where the students have to choose the 3 correct answers from this list. But what's given is a food chain where the relationships are already established. So the idea here is that students need another piece of specialized knowledge other than just the transfer of matter or energy and how that's connected to these different components in order to answer the question. However, when you see down below, there's another constructive response. Use the model of the pond food chain to describe the relationship between the organisms in the pond food chain and the exchange of matter back into the environment. So what you see here is there are decomposers. So while they're not shown as part of the food chain, the student's going to need to make the connection between elements of that food chain, the decomposers, and how life cycles connect to basically matter being recycled into the environment. So, that again is a way of identifying a student's understanding of the systems behavior, that's the cross-cutting concept dimension, the content itself, disciplinary core idea, and also applying specific practices. So these next generation assessments are really clear and complete, and they're much easier to prepare students to meet the expectations when you understand how the original next generation science standards were constructed. And what's great is that you can actually achieve the goals of the next generation of West Virginia science standards by using your understanding of the original standards to basically construct the intended environment for the West Virginia next generation science standards. So I think that's a little trick that would be really helpful to you. Here another tech enhanced one where they drag and drop, another scenario question, multiple choice in this case. And so in order to even achieve the goals of the multiple choice effectively, a student's going to need to employ those practice and process skills, all three dimensions, to pull apart this scenario and actually identify the three correct answers. So I won't continue on with these examples except to say that it's really important that students learn how to first of all they develop skills and then learn how to apply those skills in context to answer any question or any problem using what they know and then actually understanding how to, through the use of a process, extend what they know with what's available to them. That's how they're going to be not only successful in the classroom, but really successful in life and successful on the different sort of bars they're going to have to hop over, whether it's a next generation assessment within West Virginia, or it's an advanced placement test, or it's an entrance exam, or frankly, even if it's a trade licensure exam. Students are better served when they can extract information and extend what they know even when they don't know everything. That's a really key skill. That's the difference between labor that can be automated and labor that can't be automated. And that's ultimately job security for these kids, and also an opportunity to participate in innovation, whether they're a salesperson or an actual inventor. The connections to Common Core ELA and Common Core Math come through those technical subject standards, which are 21st century standards, which closely relate to what you would see in your literacy standards. But the idea of using or citing evidence from the text to support their analysis, being able to summarize a text distinct from their prior knowledge, the ability to follow precisely a multi-step procedure. These are all ELA standards, okay? Expressing information visually is actually an ELA standard. Distinguishing among facts, reason, judgment, research, based on research findings and speculation in a text. All ELA focus. When you think about math, making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, modeling with math, using tools strategically, attending to precision, these are all Common Core math practices, but nonetheless they're part of any math curriculum that's worth its salt, because frankly, if you can't attend to precision, then you can't actually balance an equation. And if you can't attend to precision, you can't actually articulate a replicable procedure in an experiment. And if you can't attend to precision, you can't analyze data and extract any useful information which somebody can relate back to its original data set in any meaningful way, especially when it comes to things like time series and so on. So all of these parts, expressing repeated regularity or expressing regularity and repeated reasoning, is a key aspect of efficient procedures, which students we know need to be able to plan and so on. So there are really close connections between math, ELA, and the science environment, and approaching it this way really through the next generation science standards is an opportunity to teach math and ELA through your science time on learning if you do it properly. So where did those next generation science standards sort of come from? Well, they started with the National Research Council. They actually started before that with a Carnegie Corporation report. But nonetheless, we have a new definition of effective science instruction, or STEM instruction. And it's worth knowing that, because that was really, you know, one of the early questions that was asked before the next generation science standards were developed, is what is effective science instruction? And then what do the standards look like in order to create the environment and, you know, produce effective science instruction with students or for students. And what came out of those studies and what was the foundation of the new standards was a movement away from what you see on the left. You know, happy teacher, expert, modeling, demonstrating things for kids who watch and then repeat back. Okay, so getting rid of that model and moving toward a model where students are actually given the opportunity to wrestle with the problem and question themselves, and to advance from that problem or question to a prototype, to a test, to data, to analysis of data, to actually using the data to form a conclusion about how that question is answered, how that problem is solved. Okay, so effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. It's an intentional nurturing process. And so that's, you know, kind of a key issue with the way the next generation of West Virginia science standards have been articulated, because capitalizing on students' early interests and experiences is a kind of vertical articulation. It's an intentional nurturing process. It's great that that's been done, sort of by, you know, talking about what happens in grade 1 and grade 2 and so on, but it's so vague that it's really hard for somebody to interpret that specifically enough to be in sync with what other schools are doing. And so that presents an issue when it comes to transients and any kind of alternative education provider for those students, whether they are in foster care in one town and, you know, end up back with their parents in a different town, whether they move chasing rent from, you know, one spot to another, whether they're entirely newcomers because, you know, they're immigrants or they've moved in, parents have taken the job in the company or so on, and they end up in your school. So intentionally nurturing early interest and experiences starting in pre-K, kindergarten, and following that student intentionally from one grade level to the next is huge, because that gives you the opportunity to build on what they know, and then providing them with these kind of experiences like you see on the right, where students are engaged in those practices. Those practices are those 8 practices I mentioned earlier, actually engaging students in using the skills that are specific to science and engineering. And I think, you know, to say that they're specific to science and engineering is probably an overstatement. They're useful in many areas of life, but without them, engaging in science and engineering is impossible. And having a regular science class with sufficient time on learning and a rigorous scope and sequence within the year, September through June, such that it sustains student interest, because again, think about how much more interested a student is in taking their ideas and bringing them to life than they are in listening to somebody and repeating what they've heard. It's much more engaging to take your own idea and create and try, and it keeps students engaged in the concept of science and engineering as a career choice, or as an interest or something that they could be good at and not afraid of math and not afraid of science or engineering much longer and much more likely over the course of their life than something in which complex ideas are told and complex ideas need to be remembered, and the relationships are not necessarily a framework which a student has built themselves through their own experiences. So a lot of thought goes into how you go from those standards into actual curriculum in the classroom so that you can actually deliver effective STEM instruction to your students in a way that's not what you see on the left, because it's really not possible to deliver effective instruction in that environment, but to what you see on the right, where you have student-centered, hopefully project-based, hopefully hands-on learning, so that students are in that role of scientist and engineer. Now, one of the challenges in doing this is that most of the resources that are out there are geared towards awareness readiness. What that means is, and actually knowledge readiness and some performance readiness. Very few are aimed at mastery readiness. And I'll kind of try to paint the picture of what the difference is. So awareness ready resources are the kind of resources you see and on the internet, 2-page lesson plan downloads. Companies offer them, museums offer them. They're really kind of, well, first of all, they typically are very vague, but they're aimed at explaining something very kind of small and simple to students so they are aware. For instance, a company may have engineers, and so they might produce a very simple kind of lesson or explanation that a teacher could use and adapt or whatever to try to explain to students what an engineer is. So as a result of engaging in that resource, students will be able to raise their hand and say, I know engineers solve problems. But students don't necessarily know all about what engineers, problems they've solved. They aren't equipped with the skills to be able to, engage in problem solving. So that, kind of being able to raise your hand and identify something is about as far as you get with an awareness-ready resource. Knowledge-ready resources, we think about textbooks when it comes to knowledge-ready resources. Textbooks tell all about what scientists have discovered and engineers have solved, problems engineers have solved, the kind of technology they've produced. So knowledge readiness is kind of being ready, knowing about something. Maybe it means you can explain it. Doesn't mean that you have the skills to engage in actually extending that knowledge, but you know about things. Don't necessarily know how to be a scientist or engineer, and that's a key factor. Performance readiness is something we kind of relate to kits often, where a performance-ready resource is a resource that helps students to develop a specific task knowledge. And so, for instance, an example of this would be around rocks and minerals, that students learn that rocks and minerals have different levels of hardness, and if you have a rock or mineral and you want to know how hard it is, you can carry out the task of scratching it on different surfaces of different levels of hardness. So what's great about that is that students do get some hands-on exposure, whatever. Many of the performance-ready resources that exist now are simply students doing a demonstration for themselves, which is much more of a knowledge-ready thing than a performance-ready thing. There's a diagram or a procedure the student follows, and they, instead of the teacher doing the demonstration for the student basically does the demonstration from themselves, following a procedure or a diagram or a step-by-step kind of thing. Might be a culminating activity, might be, you do this and there's a worksheet, that kind of a thing. Mastery readiness is very different. Mastery readiness is centered on skills so that a student can take those skills that they've developed, which are, back to those practices we had talked about earlier. I'll flash those back up here for you. So mastery readiness is about taking those skills that students have developed, the ability to develop a model, the ability to plan, the ability to analyze, and so on, and using it to take what they know, so content that they know, and analyze and extend what they know to develop and use what they know in order to answer a question or solve a problem with whatever new information is given to them. Okay, and this could be a basic scenario like one of the ones we have seen earlier, right? There's, if we haven't planted plants and water, if we haven't put them in these kind of bottles, we really don't know anything about that, but we can take what we do know, we can take our skills, and we can actually extend what we know and come to a thoughtful conclusion about these two statements made by fictional students and actually use the data that's given to support our own claim about whether or not these statements are valid. So that is what mastery readiness is all about. So it's very different than what you get with the kits and textbooks and whatnot. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so proud of what we do here at KnowAtom, because we develop mastery ready resources really focused on students developing those skills and then creating the context where students develop mastery of the performance expectations and actually carry out are able to bring those pieces together in novel contexts and use the scientific process of the engineering design process to be able to answer problems and questions that, frankly, are not the result of direct instruction, because that's life. And when we think about that, that's why curriculum, professional development, and materials have to fit together. They have to fit together, but you are really well served when they fit together kind of hand in glove. Because from a student's perspective, the way things are defined, the expectations are all consistent. From a teacher's perspective, all the materials you have that you need for your lessons are available and take into account what that student learning environment requires, so you're not lacking anything. And from a professional development standpoint, you understand how to implement those resources and what resources you have available and what best practices are known and where students typically run into challenges and so on. So think about that, curriculum, professional development materials as having to be all next generation aligned, all aligned with itself, and all supporting that STEM learning environment. Okay. Now, I had mentioned earlier the idea of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and there's actually a connection between them. And that connection is really that culture of critique, those higher order thinking skills, the creating, evaluating, and analyzing. In the case of art, it's coming together in communication, because art, real art, is engineered communication. That's why artists often in the wrong place get in trouble. They can go to jail in certain places, or worse happens. There are bloggers in places like Bangladesh that lose their lives because of the statements they make using language. That's why we call it English language arts, because the English language can be an art. It's not about just filling in a blank. It's not just about sentence structure. It's about actually communicating something. So when you think about the skills, the precision, the critical thinking, the creative, evaluative, and analytical skills that students develop within the context of science, technology, and engineering, and math, those skills are applicable to the arts, whether it's music, whether it's sculpture, whether it's painting, whether it's photography, whether it's writing. In that culture of critique that we talked about earlier, where students in the classroom aren't just being, there's a full release of responsibility, but they aren't just being released for an hour to kind of do whatever, try to solve a problem open-endedly. There's actually a process structure to that, just the way that there is in writing. In writing there are practices, word choice, voice, sentence structure, things like that. Those are the tools to engage in writing. But in order to publish a high-quality work, you have to engage in something called the writing process, where you brainstorm, you pre-write, you may peer review and draft and revise, and then publish. And the reason that you go through that process is that It's a logical way of going from an idea to a high-quality published work. So when you think about the role of the practices, those 8 practices I showed you earlier, those are the tools. It's the processes for science, or the process for science, and the different process for engineering, that engineering design process, which is how the students go from the question to the evidence-based conclusion logically, or from the problem to the evidence-based solution logically. So in the case of so you have that culture of critique where students practice that in the classroom. They come to you to check, every 15 minutes you have checkpoints where students are coming up to you, as they reach those checkpoints, milestones, and you're holding the expectations high and actually critiquing what they've given you and asking questions, pushing back, employing the Socratic method. In the case of art, it's very similar. Artists, quality artists, are trained in a culture of critique where somebody pushes back to ask about their choices, ask about what they're thinking, ask about what they're trying to communicate, and ask how and why they made the choices they made in constructing a specific work. And I pulled this example up of Guernica by Pablo Picasso because it's probably one of the best known works. Most people have heard of it, known it. Pablo Picasso is the same. Fairly commonplace, someone that everyone has heard about. But to really understand what made Pablo as well as Guernica famous is the fact that he was a master communicator, that his art was communication. And in this case, Guernica was a work that he created to communicate to the world as well as the fascists about atrocities that were committed in Guernica in Spain by the fascists. And when he created this work, it was for an international art expo, and so he made a statement. He sent it to this international art expo, and it resonated with people. In fact, it resonated so much so that the fascists actually came back and said, "What did you do?" And as the story goes, Pablo Picasso turned around and said, "I didn't do what you did." And so without words, he was able to convey a message which was controversial, a message which resonated with a particular target audience, and which required him to think critically, to create, evaluate, and analyze his message as well as his audience in order to make the two connect in a way that was meaningful and in a way that only he could do in this medium. So thinking that way, the connection between art and thinking is the same as the connection between STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math, and thinking. It's all thinking, and it's all a higher order thinking in action, and a useful, specific, and targeted skill set, which which is relevant on both sides. So I'll leave sort of that alone here, except to say that art defined as an aesthetic, or making things aesthetically pleasing, is kind of a cheap concept of art. It's and I mean cheap by kind of basic. It's a very basic idea of what art is, because when you look at this work of art, it's not particularly aesthetically pleasing. However, it's high art because of what it communicates, and its level of sophistication, and its timing, and the way that its author, the artist, was able to connect with its audience. And so when you think about artists going to jail, that's why. Because they are able to communicate in this way, and that is, when you think of art as engineered communication, that's why it can be controversial. Nobody goes to jail for making pretty things. Pretty things are very rarely controversial. So, it's something to keep in mind. Now, when you pull these skills together and you develop them in students, and I'm going to wrap up here, you see data gains. And so here's some examples of data gains that we've seen in communities using, in different states, using our approach, a next generation approach, next generation aligned resources, even under the existing assessment structure. So in New Hampshire, we've seen students performing, you see here in blue and in green, upwards of 20% over the state average. And that's on the New England Common Assessment Program, which is really a close, we'll say close to aligned or almost next generation aligned assessment because of the inquiry portion of that assessment. And that has historically been used by Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. And when you look at the subgroups, sort of the strands of that, there's physical science, earth science, life science, and an inquiry strand. The reason I say it's kind of aligned to next generation science standards is that next generation science standards have inquiry infused across each of the strands, and also there's a Earth includes space, and there is a engineering strand as well, which you don't see shown here. But what you see in purple and in yellow are our students versus the state average, which you see in pink and in this teal color. So again, performing double digits percentages over and above in all categories the state average, and over here, quite dramatically. And it makes sense. When you teach students inquiry skills, they perform very highly in inquiry. And then, of course, they can apply that thinking into all these other environments. So again, outperforming their peers. In places like Massachusetts, you can see similar gains even under a different assessment, the Massachusetts Common Assessment Program. Here's an environment where there are 35% of the students whose first language is not English. 72% of them are low income, 65% of them are free lunch, 75% of them are high need, and yet over the course of 2.5 years, they go from 36% proficient to 87% proficient and advanced. And you can see the levels of needs improvement dropping. Now, there were shocks to the system, changes of administration, changes of teachers, and so on, but yet you can see a positive trend, okay, where the level of advanced and proficient scoring students are continually increasing over time. In other environments, which are only 20% high needs and 7% low income, you see similar double-digit gains, and those gains being sustained over time. So in places where there are less transients, it's much easier to make the gains and sustain them than they are in environments where there's high levels of transients, and also sort of we can almost think of them as transients in teachers where there's changes at that level. Okay. Now, just to give you a sense, in this state, the state average is 50% advanced and proficient. So you can see how these guys went from average to well above average. Same thing here, 50% from below average to well above average. Okay. Same thing here. Average would be 50%, and these guys are trending up above average. And the levels of warning, failing, sort of those low-level developing students are really bottomed out here in many ways. The number one school and district here for elementary science is one of our clients as well, and you can see how they have been able to increase their gains as well and sustain them upwards of 90%, almost double the state average. And even in places like this is a school with very high needs, and I'll show you what that is in a second. Over the course of 2 years, they went from just 4% proficient to 28%, so a 24-point gain. And what's even more interesting is that they basically cut their lowest level students in half, the number of students scoring in this lowest level, warning and failing, in half, basically. And that's at a grade 8 level. Now, these students that I just showed you, 95% low income, 64% first language is not English, 97% high needs, 87% free lunch. So difficult, and a situation that many districts in West Virginia are faced with, and actually worse in many ways than some districts are faced with in West Virginia. But nonetheless, positive gains can be made. And what's quite interesting about this, which is not shown on the graph, is that they are now performing at the average among their peers. So just 2 years, they go from well below average for cities in Massachusetts to well, in line with average. And then hopefully, as the testing continues, we'll be able to see them gain over and above that. And when you look at the accountability results, so with changes in standards, you often get changes in testing, and then this, when federal funding becomes available for these sort of things, tends to bring in accountability requirements at the school level, because when funding's given, there is a desire for accountability for that funding, insofar as that happens. And so the way that was done here at this particular school, or really in the state of Massachusetts, but in this particular school, how it looks is the state sets accountability thresholds, and those are specific to subgroups. And when the school meets or exceeds those thresholds, or even approaches them within certain margins, they receive points. And those points show their level of performance as a school, and then those are aggregated to show performance as a district against, sort of peers and thresholds, so that when schools aren't increasing student performance, or they aren't meeting basic thresholds or even approaching them, that there's an opportunity to consider why, and to prompt the schools to consider why, and even at a state level sometimes to intervene. So you can see here that all these categories, the school did receive points, which is a huge deal, and they even exceeded the categories, getting extra credit, and those as well as full credit for meeting others. So really, as you think about what these standards mean, and perhaps in the future as the parts come together, you can see that the next generation approach to teaching and learning, that next generation model of instruction, produces data gains even under existing testing frameworks, because that's the power of teaching students to think, and even in environments that are difficult, very difficult to achieve gains in. So nonetheless, I will leave it there. I will give you a link, if you're interested, to the second part of this series, which is strategically implementing the next generation science standards, which would be relevant to you in West Virginia. You can reach that by going to www. Or you can just type in KnowAtom.com/strategically, and that will bring you to a page where you can register and view that second webinar in the series. It's free, an hour of your time, which isn't free, but otherwise it's no cost to you. If you do have any question about resources that are available on our site, you have trouble registering for this, you have more questions as a result of this webinar, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy. She's our STEM curriculum specialist. If you have a question specifically for me, feel free to forward that question along to her. She'll get it to me. And her email address is mdelacy@knowatom.com. I hope one way or another that you'll stay connected and up to date and what's happening with these standards. One way to do that is to subscribe to our blog. You can just go to KnowAtom.com/blog. We publish regular articles about little pieces of how and why and where and all of that sort of stuff related to science and engineering standards and how they're being implemented and best practices and things like this. We also have a bunch of free ebooks and webinars and other resources available under KnowAtom.com/resources, or you can just click the resources link at the top of our page. We also have interviews with innovators and how they, how they engage in innovation themselves, and how they view innovation, and how they view the new standards, and how they view science and engineering in the K-12 classroom, and they share their path to innovation as part of that discussion. That's available there too. And then I think most importantly, resources that you'll want to take a look at are examples of NGSS aligned curriculum and sample readers, which you see at the top. You can get to those by going to KnowAtom.com/curriculum, or what you can do is just go to KnowAtom.com and click STEM curriculum at the top. Scroll down the page about halfway, you'll see samples of grades 1 through 8. There is one unit, so a month's worth of content and reader available for each of those grade levels. We do have more available, but unfortunately they're for purchase, not sort of free and open to you to check out. So if you are interested, your district's in some kind of a curriculum review, you want to find out about purchasing or adopting something like that, you can reach out to Mary Ellen as well about that, and she'll get to the right person. And you can check out more about the results of these sort of next generation inquiry models being employed in real schools by downloading a case study at knowatom.com/results. I hope you've found this time helpful. Again, my name is Francis Vigent, and I appreciate your taking the time to think more about mastering the next generation of West Virginia science standards. I hope you'll reach out if we can be of more help, and I hope you enjoy your time and the rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.